name's Joe Cernick. I'm a member of the faculty here at Lindenwood University, and I'd like to welcome you to Insight. Now, Insight is a show where we normally discuss books on politics, both domestically and internationally, sometimes historical books that provide an insight into the present, sometimes broader trend analysis or atmospherics books that help to put some political issues into perspective. Today's book is on domestic government. It's written by four people, John Gov't, Lane Kenworthy, Peter Lindert, and Jeff Madrick, and the book is called How Big Should Our Government Be? Now, joining me on the show today are three Lindenwood University students. To my immediate right is Olivia Stedman. To Olivia's right is Raphael Bolognini. To Raphael's right is Taylor Swinford. So I want to read an opening quote, and then we can jump into a discussion about the book. The authors write, "There is a national instinct that small government is always better than large government, and that thinking is grounded not in fact, but in ideology and politics. As the reader will see in the following pages, the very history of America, a country whose skepticism of government lies deep in its national character, should rebuke fears that government would grow too large. The federal government adopted new responsibilities throughout America's history, and its size grew with no appreciable effect on the economy."
This book was really eye-opening to me about the size of our government and just what the government does in regards to helping our economy, hurting our economy, building programs. So definitely there are a lot of effects on our economy of what the government implements.
Right. I think that what the authors are essentially trying to do is to refute this idea that we have of a small government from the 1700s, that we think they're going to at the same time reduce spending and meet the needs of all Americans. But we need to consider that today we have a population of over 300 million people here. So
I think the notion that small government trumps bigger government in our country is understandable when you look at our founding and early history. However, I think we like to chalk it up as more of a difference in philosophy when really we haven't really looked at the facts, when in fact we can study it more.
Yeah, quote again to give a sense of the book: "The need for more government to help us maintain a just society and a prosperous economy becomes more evident by the day. Today, more than ever before, low-income Americans are more dependent for their survival on government social programs."
I definitely think that we are becoming more dependent on social programs, and the authors do talk about how there are four major areas where bigger government actually is helpful. So they talked about infrastructure, schooling and resources, the earned income tax credit, and programs that help form economic security, such as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And I do think that we lose sight of the spending that has to go into creating those programs and developing that type of economic security, that it comes from a bigger government and more spending.
Mm-hmm. And we see in other countries like in Europe how a bigger government is able to meet the needs of everybody, and how much higher their life standards are compared to America, because they have a bigger government that offers more assistance to everybody, and especially the needy. So we see how their life standards are much better than ours because they have a bigger government.
And I think that's just what the authors are trying to argue. They're arguing that the extension of our government is kind of inevitable, as well as other governments, like you said, in Europe. But they do agree that there's going to need to be a rise in taxes, definitely, to fund those things.
Yeah, one of the things they challenge is this notion of laissez-faire is good for America, and they say this self-identifying myth is largely wrong. Government was always a strong force in the United States, even in colonial years. And so then you're looking at the reasons why you have a big government and how it is not adversely affecting the economy.
And
Right.
it's definitely, the early years are something that we look at and we talk about it being a smaller government, but the government did things like the National Bank, the Louisiana Purchase, and all of these major ideas and concepts that developed who we are today. And so I think we forget that even though everyone saw it as a smaller government, it was a big government.
Right, and today conservatives usually talk back about how Jefferson was a small government founding father, but actually, if you look back in history, he did a lot of regulation to help people acquire land, so that's not really small government.
Definitely. Jefferson definitely was slightly a hypocrite in that area because he was very against big government. However, he did things like the Louisiana Purchase that definitely went against his own ideology.
Yeah, they address Alexander Hamilton trying to promote industrial policy, so a role for the federal government, and then Jefferson with his land deals, and then where the federal government didn't get involved, you see the states aggressively push economic development and raise taxes to fund it, and that the states aggressively start to push for financing education. So he's developing and looking through things like the 1853 Morrill Act, which is a land grant program. So as a result, you're seeing a number of these situations. He's talking about that there was a need maybe for even more government in parts of the 19th century when you were having unemployment rates that were exceeding 15% of the population. So maybe we even needed more government to help sanitation. Another big government function needed to be taken over for health reasons. So he goes through various things like this.
Right. He talks about how government started colleges, they started the postal service, the sanitation, and there's all of these things that we use and we take advantage of every day that I think a lot of people forget started in government and that the government created.
Yeah, I think what we see is that throughout the American history, the growth that we've had was because and when government intervened. Like after the Civil War, the government donated a lot of lands for the construction of a railroad, which led to the expansion of businesses and trade in the country. So we see how this intervention leads to more growth of the economy.
Yeah, the authors talk about how in the late 1800s and early 1900s, attitudes kind of changed about big government, and because of that, government stepped up, and that's where they created different labor laws as well as the sanitation, as you had mentioned.
Yeah, he was talking how the country was in essentially problems of chaos before Roosevelt started to impose some sorts of stability through regulations in the 1930s during the New Deal, and that led to stability and prosperity after the end of the Second World War. So they're looking at it from a point of view which, say, many conservatives would sort of try to say, no, it's completely wrong. And in fact, I mean, talking to Eisenhower in the 1950s, who spent an enormous program on the federal interstate highway system, so that how that helped America. So through many of these years, you're looking at this is a situation where we're seeing a situation where incomes are getting better for Americans, that the gap between rich and poor is closing. And that as you begin to say, I don't like big government, well, the gap gets larger.
And I think my favorite part when he's talking about that was when he was talking about the 20s and how the decade of the 20s was where a lot of people were really pushing back against big government, and then we ended up having a giant Great Depression and stock market crash. So it just really showed how we need the bigger government to continue growing with the size of our country and to continue regulating to help us get through these changing economic times.
Right. It seems that when we let markets run wild in this country is when we see big recessions, because when we don't regulate markets, they tend to run wild and do whatever they want, and that's when we see problems here.
Yeah, you can definitely tell that we have a kind of love-hate relationship with big government and government programs. When we don't necessarily need it, we're fighting for smaller government. However, whenever we do hit some kind of economic crisis, that's when everyone is pushing for it and a little more favorable of those programs.
He has some quotes here. He says between 1979 And 2013 average income among households in the bottom fifth rose by just $1,500. But then he goes on, researchers suggest that in any given year, 10 to 20% of working age American households will experience an income decline of 25% or more, and about twice that number will experience this kind of income drop from one year to the next at some point over the period of 10 years. The incidence of these large year-to-year income declines has increased since the late 1970s. So he's trying to address some of the problems you got to deal with.
And that's basically what widens this gap, this inequality gap, is this deregulation. And we see, like I mentioned before, in other countries that when they regulate more, they close this gap. So maybe we should do that here as well, right?
Yeah, I agree with that, because the deregulation is what really just allows the upper wealthy class to just run free with their wealth and to really monopolize the markets that they have so much influence over, and then that just kind of leaves all of us lower middle class Americans in the dust.
He had a quote here on people marrying, and I like to watch things on what's called the Turner Movie Classic Station, which is a lot of movies from the 40s a lot of times. But he says Americans increasingly tend to marry a partner with somebody who has attained a similar level of education. This shift is likely to have further lowered the odds that somebody starting at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder will end up in the middle or higher. Whereas when a lot of the movies, the themes when you see marriages, it's people marrying different socioeconomic levels, and it was taken as normal from the perception of the 40 movies. But here they're telling you, no, you're not going to see that.
It's not normal at all. I think that's so true, because like I personally would probably not marry someone that didn't even try to go to college, so I would agree with that. And I mean, a guy that has a doctorate is definitely going to want a woman who can hold her own with her education, so I would agree with his standpoint on that.
And he talks about how big government can reduce the opportunity gap, and that it would be through providing high quality, affordable education to everybody, and then increasing college and graduation rates, and lastly, by providing like a child tax credit to families of low income.
They definitely heavily suggest reducing the cost of college. They reference the free public university in many European countries such as Denmark and Finland and Norway. And they argue that this would put a lot more money into the hands of families that have lower income.
But he talks about the issues also with education at the young age, and how there's such a difference in opportunity for the lower income families with their children, putting them through preschool or a private school at a young age, or even being able to stay home with a parent and having that more one-on-one time with their parent, than the lower income families where they have to put their child in some type of babysitter or other care that's probably less effective on their education in their early years than an upper class family.
That's something I can definitely see. I personally work in childcare, and we're pretty moderately priced for our area. However, we're not required to take children whose family is on state aid. So if you see someone who's maybe in a government-run Head Start program, their program is going to look a lot different than the program that we have, because we get more money, we get more funding, so our program is a lot better. And then if you see the kindergarten entrance testing from children who are coming from a Head Start program versus coming from a private program like the one I work for, it's vastly different.
And that's why we keep this cycle of poverty going all the time, because we do these kinds of things.
Yeah, he has a whole thing in here on income growth, and that it was good in the period between roughly 1940s and 1970s, and since then it's been flat, that people's income has flattened out. And so this is the sort of, then they're trying to look at the situation of the Great Recession that had hit with the period beginning around 2007, 2008, and so in some ways we've even erased any progress that might have been made prior to that.
And I definitely think it's something we need to consider when looking at numbers, is that, I mean, numbers of wage might increase slightly, but usually that has to do with the inflation and adjusting for the cost of living rising. So really, Americans are making probably less than they were But it just, the number is sort of higher, so to speak, just because they're trying to make up for the higher cost to live.
One of the ways they're trying to show you U.S. contrasted with other countries in government spending says in almost all affluent nations, the earnings of low-end households has risen little, if at all, since the late 1970s. So, like the United States, but he says instead, it is increases in government transfers that have tended to drive up household incomes in these countries. And so the role of government spending to help people out at the lower end.
He argues a lot about this idea of government transfer and how it worked in other countries. Now, I don't know if that idea would stick in America. Probably not right now. But definitely what we see in rich nations actually is that when government transfers some income to lower income people, we see the growth of the economy that country because people have more purchasing power. They have more money to spend now that the government is helping them.
I think it's the idea that if the people prosper in general, then in turn the nation will prosper as well.
Mm-hmm.
He has a whole thing, then they go through how much more government spending do we need. He says it's about 10% of gross domestic product. How can we pay for it? So then they're addressing something called a national consumption tax could help out, and then minor additions to adjustments in the tax system. And also one of the things is to increase the payroll tax. So they're looking at some tax increases, but then they're trying to say that offsets it by how this helps with economic growth, because if you're holding too many back, it's not going to help us to grow as an economy as a whole.
But I think if they did tax things like alcohol, tobacco, I think you mentioned gasoline, and even, I mean, we're in this debate over whether or not to legalize marijuana. If you just legalize it and put a tax on it, that could help us so much more with getting that necessary funding in order to increase our spending to that 10% of the GDP. And I think by taxing those things that, I mean, tobacco, alcohol, they're not necessities. So a higher tax would not hurt the people who are able to afford to purchase those things anyway. And I think that would definitely help with achieving the goals of that funding we need.
Right.
Quote, because the federal government has tended to treat large banks as too big to fail, investors and management know they are likely to be rescued by taxpayers if their bets go sour, and this allows those banks to engage in riskier strategies that have potentially higher profit margins and encourage investors to choose those banks that are involved in these perilous activities over competitors. So I guess one of the things, because they were trying to address that, was then would some of these people be putting them into more stable, maybe mid-sized banks where the loans might be able to get out there in a better way. And so the theme, I think, of the book certainly is higher taxes goes along with economic growth. And so it doesn't seem like they're trying to address it as a major onerous tax increase, and obviously it's not going to hit everybody the same, but they are pointing to the notion that this is different than, say the Trump administration's look at, we're going to get rid of lots of regulations, we're going to reduce taxes to support economic growth. This book is completely opposite the Trump administration.
And then it comes to that question, if we drop taxes, who's going to pay for what we already have, like schools and health care? Like Olivia mentioned, I think that if we raise taxes, that benefits everybody in the long term. And that's what he emphasizes here a lot, is to look at the long term, not the short term, not what may happen 5 years from now, but what's going to happen 10, 20 years from now.
I think the idea that cutting different government regulations on businesses and corporations is a good idea. I think that's kind of interesting, because if you think about it, we set all of these regulations in place in the beginning, so we have better quality of services and products. So I think taking those away is kind of it's like a step backwards, a step in time.
Yeah, and then he has all sorts of charts So he says the United Kingdom, the United States, Sweden, Japan. He goes, well, prospering, they also channeled an increasingly larger share of their national product into taxes that were spent on social programs, and yet they continued to prosper.
And I think we should definitely learn from those countries because raising our taxes, raising our spending would ultimately help our programs. And there are some programs that, I mean, Social Security is one of the biggest ones where we don't necessarily know where the funding for that is going to come from in 20, 30 years from now. So I think that we should definitely look at those countries and use them as an example instead of cutting funding from other areas and trying to spend less, like education or the other programs that help the lower income families, because that's not going to help in the long run.
All right, and we can see even in this country today how different taxes in different states work to attract companies. Like in the South, for instance, we see that they do have lower taxes, lower corporate taxes, but they are not the states that attract the most companies. The states that attract most companies are New York, California, Connecticut, and some of them have really high corporate taxes.
Right, because it says it here, for all the conservative media anecdotes about companies fleeing from high tax states to low tax one, there is no results showing any damage to the higher taxing and higher welfare states. And so, and again, he goes through this for different statistics and graphs, charts. So when you try and explain how the impact from higher taxes actually is not adversely affecting the American economy.
Right, and I think that's one thing that we all look at as Americans is that taxes, even though they look bad, we forget to look at what they go for, and I think sometimes we get lost in what the government is spending our tax money on and what they're spending tax money on in general, and so I think that's one of the biggest areas that we could all be more aware of what exactly taxes are being used for.
I think what they're looking at is trying to increase the minimum wage was one, and something called the Earned Income Tax Credit, so that you use that to continue to help people at the bottom. They're not talking, because he says here that when we're looking at something called the welfare state, we are seeing how it relates to positive economic growth, but he's excluding economic spending. And so what he's doing is talking about things they call transfer spending. So that as a result, then you're trying to look at the notion of how all this helps the economic growth picture.
And we do have this government transfer type of idea in America. It emerged probably during the New Deal with Social Security and unemployment compensation and food stamps. Now it hasn't been perfect, but we've seen that it works to drive incomes up.
I think one of the biggest problems we're having right now as a country is that we are so stuck on the fact that we think we need to have smaller government. It's something that we truly, cherish. However, as the authors repeatedly state, there's really no clear evidence that states that a welfare state has any real negative consequences on the economy.
There's a section in this book, and it was just briefly developed, but he said broader taxes are cheaper to administer. And so obviously anything costs money even when you're collecting taxes, so you're trying to spend less on the administration of collecting taxes as a way of then having more money to spend. So they mentioned this, but I didn't think they really developed that part, and I would have liked to have seen that at least developed in the book to say exactly how does that work.
I think he talked about it a little bit in regards to a couple of other countries and how they have more of just one giant tax than they have a lot of these smaller taxes. And so we have income tax, we have sales tax, we have all of these smaller taxes instead of just maybe charging one broad tax to cover those costs. And I feel like that's something that he was trying to get at when he was talking about that.
Yeah, in Europe they call that a value-added tax, and so which I don't think is discussed in the book, but I know from when I was there.
Yeah, but
And healthcare is another big thing they address in the book as being cheaper in other countries. So as a result, we're seeing problems associated with how much we spend on healthcare.
That's because they regulate more in other countries, so they can drive the costs down, whereas here we don't regulate enough, so the costs run just wild.
I think it's interesting because a lot of the argument regarding universal health care in America is that it's going to be too bureaucratic if it's government centralized. However, in other countries, it's really shown that it's less bureaucratic because they're not spending quite as much money on administrative things. For instance, hiring specific teams of people to make sure you're actually poor enough to receive the benefits that you're saying you need to receive. And we're spending money on things like that, where other countries aren't spending as much money on that. So they have more money for the actual health care.
Well, and they also, because they do regulate it so much, the pharmaceutical industry so much better in other countries. There's not one country monopolizing a necessity for someone like the diabetes medication, insulin. Sorry, took a minute. But we saw that last year where they were able to, because this one company provided so much of it, drive that cost up. And if we were able to regulate that with government spending, government taxes, bigger government, we could bring that cost back down and make that healthcare affordable.
We only have a few minutes left, so what did you think of this book?
I found the book interesting in the sense that I did not understand the economics of a bigger government, and so his point of views on how to make our government spending more effective were actually very interesting, and they make you think a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think, and it's very contrary to what we hear since we're childhood in this country, that government should be small and that's going to be a benefit to everybody, but that's not what the authors are arguing about.
It was definitely interesting and contrary to a lot of what you hear in media regarding economics. However, I think unfortunately it's a little too soon for America right now. I don't think we're quite ready to switch to that big of a government.
I don't think it's going to happen, but no, it's contrary to the Trump administration, certainly, and they're making a good case. I would like to see when they say a little bit higher taxes, exactly if we take people at certain financial levels, what do you mean exactly? Show me, like somebody making $35,000, $40,000, $55,000, and just show it. They're not, and certainly through the book, they're in no way implying excessively higher taxes, but how, in fact, it would help, and so I understand their principle there. So it's an economics book, and it's written with charts and graphs, so it's not like a general public read book, and it's short, but you can get through it. So it's an interesting book, and thank you for joining us today.